Well, I say that. I'm Nate Harmon. I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'll get into the talk here. I'm Nate Harmon, work for Level 12. Been with Randy for about 10 years now, working there, and I actually am self-taught in Python with, I would say, I'm going to use some examples here of Sensei from Karate Kid, but Randy would sort of be my sensei in terms of learning me or teaching me development. So I learned that later in life, picked it up after school, and so so this talk is a beginner talk, and so let me get my notes up here. So we have a smaller group than we normally do. I was going to ask how many of you, you've only been learning Python or programming for about a year. So I heard a lot of you guys have been developing for a little bit, maybe a couple years, some of you longer than others. So if you're just learning Python, you're just learning programming, this talk is for you. If you have been a programmer for a while, this talk can be for you because it can teach you maybe something new that you might be able to use to mentor others who are learning how to program. Okay, so here's a question for you all. How many of you have developed a habit of writing tests with your code? Those of you who've been developing for a while. I see one hand back there. All right. So great. So this will be a great talk for all of you then. All right. So I just want to introduce you briefly to a project that's been around for a while. I didn't write this project. It's called Python Koans. I think I'm saying that right. The term koan comes from Zen Buddhism, and my understanding is that it's a type of test for tracking progress towards enlightenment. So the idea here is that we're going to learn a little bit about how you can be enlightened towards Python. So the concept comes from its predecessor. You'll notice here on the page that I've got up on the screen here, somewhere down here, it mentions that it's actually, if you're familiar with Ruby, the Ruby programming language, I think it may have been the first one. This one built off of another project called Ruby Koans. And it's really just a means of learning how to program in Python. So 3 things that I'll try to highlight here as we get into the project, and I'll move to the code here in a minute, that this project can teach you about. One would be the Zen of Python. So in sticking with the Enlightenment theme there, the Zen of Python is been around for a while. I think I've actually got it up here. So notice import this. So if some of you learned print Hello World voice for your first project, you can also learn import this and in your Python REPL and get the Zen of Python. But it's basically just some axioms or some guidelines for how to write good code. And so it's one of the things that you can learn as you're using this particular project to learn about Python. It also teaches you the basic syntax and data structures and how to use them. And the nice thing about it is that it has a means of building upon. So it's sort of like a course, really. It starts with very basic structures, and then it builds upon that knowledge. And then the third benefit here is that you learn how to write and think about code using something called TDD, or test-driven development. And so if you start out early, then you can learn good development practices that will help you grow as a developer. You'll be exercising development muscles that maybe, I've seen a lot of courses out there. There's a lot of resources out there. Not many of them start this way in terms of teaching you through test-driven development, teaching you through testing. And one of the things that I learned early on when I started programming is that really by doing test-driven development, you're able to think about the code differently. It forces you to think about things a little bit more strategically than you may if you're not writing tests. So I mentioned the example of Karate Kid. So here's how I kind of think about this project. If you've seen the Karate Kid movies, whether the original from the 80s or there was a more recent one in 2010, I think it was, the Python Koans project is like your virtual Mr. Miyagi, or Mr. Han, if you will, from the newer one. So some examples here we'll get into in a bit, just to play on that theme. If you remember, if you've seen Karate Kid, you have the scene in the early one where he's waxing on and waxing off the car, and he's painting the fence and the house. Or in the newer one, the little boy has to learn how to pick up his coat, and he just does it over and over and over again, right? And he's learning through this. So I say this as an example because it may seem when you're working through this project that it's... Oh, you YouTube living me?
I do have the phone on vibrate. It's not supposed to do that.
Because it may seem when you get into this project, it's kind of boring. I don't really want to do the discipline of learning testing. And if you go back to the Karate Kid movies, both the examples there, they sort of got frustrated. They got annoyed with. They didn't understand, how is this useful to me? How am I going to get better at excelling at karate in those examples? But in the end, after they practice and exercise those muscles over and over again, they began to grow and develop. And so hopefully, as we get into this, you'll see some opportunities to exercise some new muscles there. So brief explanation of test-driven development. And let me switch over here so that maybe you can see some code. All right. Yeah, I'll just start. Well, no, I'll show you over here. So you'll notice here, I've actually got the project set up. We'll talk in a minute about how to set it up, but I've got it set up here and I've started running it. And you'll notice some colors here. Is that big enough for everybody to see? Let's make it a little bit bigger. That better? Okay. So you got some green and you got some red there. So the concept of test-driven development is basically... you can remember it by this way: red, green, refactor. And so you start, the first thing you do before you write your code is you write a test. And you write a test that fails, right? So that's where you get the red in there. So the red is a failing test. Then you write the code that then will fix that test. And then you run your test again and you get green and it passes. I've learned that's one of the joys of programming, is that it can be sort of like a game. Oh, it's frustrating. I've got this broken test, but now I fix the code and I make it pass, and it's like a small little victory. And then as you go along the way, because you're building up a code base of tests, then you can later on refactor that code. And if for some reason your test breaks again, you can see and know why. You have some evidence as to what you've done potentially wrong, or maybe you're just changing the code in a way that you are changing the logic, and therefore you would need to change the test. But in that case, you may want to go back and adjust the test first. So that's just a brief introduction to test-driven development. So this project has 36 lessons, and it has over 300 koans or tests. And it's designed, like I said, to lead you from basic to complex concepts about Python, building your knowledge along the way. So, briefly here, most of you probably are familiar with GitHub and Git. I've got the project up here. This is a really simple project to start. He's got some examples here in the README. And it's just a matter of downloading the code, which I've already done. And then I have it... I have my code editor here where I've got the code already set up. So once you've downloaded and set it up, you don't really need to install any other dependencies. So sometimes you may have a project where you have other dependencies you need to install. This project in particular relies mostly on the standard library, so you can just download it, set it up, and run Python on it. Now, you will notice... he mentions some examples here where you can use a tool called Sniffer, and the Sniffer tool gives you the opportunity to, and I'll show you this by an example in a minute, that gives you the opportunity to run the tests as you update your code files. The Sniffer runs and it picks up that you've made changes, and you don't have to keep running the same code over and over again. It automatically reruns your tests for you. if you were to decide you wanted to do that, you would probably want to set up a virtual environment. I won't go into details for virtual environments here, but you would. That's something that's important when you're new to Python, learning Python. All right. Any questions before we jump in here on just a few examples? All right. So first step here is let me go to the code and show you what we got. So once you download it, and I will note here, you've got a Python 2 and a Python 3 directory. This project's been around several years. Don't use the Python 2 directory. Python 2 will be end-of-lifed here very soon, and you can go to Python 2 clock. Even have a countdown there. So 26 days, 5 hours, and 9 minutes until Python 2 is end of life. So don't use Python 2. If you're starting to learn Python, start with Python 3. So you can just ignore this directory. But once you get in there, it's very simple to start out. All you have to do is run Python and then contemplate Koans, which is a file in here. So that's your argument. And when you run that, can you see all that? Is that big enough? Make it a little bit bigger. Harder for me. Then you get some results back. And so the interesting thing about this project is it starts with files that have just a bunch of broken tests. So he's already written the broken test for you, and the goal of this is to fix the tests along the way. So when you first start out, let's see. So you'll notice down here, you've completed 5 Koans and 0 out of 37 lessons. So I went back and rebroke some of these tests so I could show you all. And then I've got 297 Koans left and 37 lessons. So I got a long way to go to finish this. But you can see here, thinking about asserts is the first lesson, if you will, that you go through. And I fixed some of those tests, and as I fix them, they've gotten green, and it shows me the results of the ones I passed. And then the one that I haven't fixed yet, it will lead me to the next one. So you can slow down and read through what your output is. It'll help point you back. And notice it says, I've not reached enlightenment yet. I have a failure where false is not true. And then it tells me to meditate on the following code, and it points me right back to where I need to go to fix that code, which I have up here. And that says line 17. So line 17 here, this is a pretty simple assert. I just need to change this to true. And as I do that, and I rerun that, now I get a new one, which points me to the next one on line 23. So as you work through these, you want to make sure you're reading the comments. You want to think through what's happening here and slow down and make sure you just understand things. So I thought this would be an interesting one for anybody who maybe is new to Python to just walk through and think through how would I troubleshoot this to understand what's going on here. It's pretty basic, but so we have a value here where we're asserting two things are true. Whenever you're running tests, you do want to there is an order here, and the order is we provide the expected value first as the argument, and then the second argument is the actual value. So what I expect here is for this to be true, not false, and that's why it's failing. But the question I would ask is, why would this be true if it's a string? If you don't know anything about strings, again, this is a basic data type. So if you're wondering what to do there, the easiest thing I could write true and that would fix it, but I may want to jump into the Python REPL and see if I can understand what's going on here. So I can just run Python in my terminal, and I can try to get an example of a string here. So I'm going to make a variable called myString, and I'm just going to I'm not going to use the exact values that I have up there. This should be true. Actually, I will do that. I'll stop after that. This should be true. And then I'm going to have another value here called empty string, and I'm just going to make that with no characters. And so I can use a function called bool, which is a boolean, tell me whether something is true or false, and I can pass in the argument for both of these and say, what is my string as a boolean, and it's a true value, and I can pass in the argument of empty string, and notice that it's false. So I think this is true of most languages, but in Python, if you have a value that is not empty, essentially, not zero, it has multiple characters, that value is assessed as true. So none is a value. That would be assessed as false. An empty string would be assessed as false. So that was just an example there. I thought it would be helpful as a means where you could go into the REPL and try to understand and troubleshoot that. So I will exit that. And now that I've learned that a string with characters in it should be true, I'll save that and run it again. And it will pass. So then I have additional output. And so you see that's basically how it goes. You just build on that. I will show you briefly here before I close. So if you do want to install the sniffer tool, basically all you have to do is run sniffer. And that shows me all that I've done. If I go back through and I run the tests, as I run the test, it will show me where it'll automatically update and continue. So you can run this side by side and continue to see what you need to do.
So the sniffer tool actually executes that, or it's just kind of monitoring?
Yeah, it's monitoring and then it runs it. Yeah. So there. I didn't look into details on it. There's an additional library depending on, and he notes that in the. If you're running on Linux, you need to install PyINotify. If you're on Windows, PyWin32, and if you're on Mac, Mac FS Events, and those are. I think I actually installed it without running that library first, and it gave me a warning that basically I think it would use up my CPU if you don't install one of those libraries. So, but yeah, so you just go through, you update it, and you update your code, and I can show you an example here if you want. Let's see. Strings with single quotes. So I'm on strings now. Let's see, line 34. Come in here. So notice in the values that I haven't completed, he basically just provides a couple of lines there to show you this is where I need to fill it in. The test says test use double quotes to create strings with single quotes. So I want to make sure that the value I expect here matches the value of string. So if I save that file and I switch back, too far, back over here, it says test use single quotes to create string with double quotes has expanded my awareness. And now I'm on to the next test. I'm getting closer towards Python enlightenment. There was one other thing I was going to say. Let me make sure I cover that. Oh, that's what it was. Yes. So one thing you may notice is you may not want to go in order. You may say, you know what, I've been doing Python for a couple years now. I'm pretty confident with strings. I don't really feel like going through that. So there is this text file here, and this text file sort of shows you the order. So if you run the command, it'll start with about a search. You go through and you fix the files in about a search, and then it will move on to about strings, and so on. If you don't want to go in order, you could simply pick. I did the example of I went to about dictionaries and made a change there. I think I have the. Basically, you just have to run the command with the name of the module that you want to run it on. So I could say about dictionaries here. If I could type. And now it just runs the test for that particular file. So, all right. So that's all I've got. You know, if you're new to Python, hopefully this is helpful for you to get started. If you're not new to Python, maybe this is something you could show to some of your friends who are maybe interested in learning Python. It's a really helpful way to get started with Python. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned wanting to set up or you should set up a virtual environment.
Yes.
To set the sniffer. Why is that?
Well, the main reason you would want to use virtual environments for just about any time you're working with Python is anytime you have an application that has Python dependencies, you may have another application that has different Python dependencies. And if you install all those in your global Python packages on your system, then you can start running into conflicts with your dependencies. So the virtual environment is a means of allowing you to essentially just have one particular area where you install all of your dependencies for that particular project. So you could install it globally. It may not mess anything up, but it's a good practice when you start Python just to get in the habit of one of the first things, just like this, learning about testing, virtual environments is one of the most important things you want to learn about when you're starting out with Python and get familiar with how you would set those up and why you'd want to use those. But that's sort of a basic overview. Let me see if I can pull up the example here. I think it's where was it? This Real Python article here is a good example. If you're interested in getting more familiar with virtual environments, that's a good place to start. So, yep. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, guys. And we'll just take a brief break while we're transitioning here. So
Feel free to get some food.
we got lots of food, and I think we expected 25 to 30 tonight. So.
There seems to be a huge wreck out on the interstate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm lucky to get out.
Thank you.
Yes, so anacondas are a giant snake.